want to spend a few minutes with you right now, kind of review briefly and talk about the long run and the short run view of the macroeconomy, and in particular of the aggregate supply curve. And once we see that, maybe that will help explain different views about what's going on in the economy today and what's it looking like for the long run, short run and long run. Remember, we started with classical economics. Do you remember what the aggregate supply curve looked like? Hopefully you do, right? It was a vertical line at full employment output. Okay, that was the aggregate supply curve, short run and long run in their view, because the short run was very short. If aggregate demand shifted, you adjusted to the new equilibrium in a reasonably efficient and quick system. Anyway, let me illustrate that, right? If you got aggregate demand 1 that dropped to aggregate demand 2, in the classical view, you went from equilibrium at A to equilibrium at B in a reasonably efficient and quick manner. Bingo, new equilibrium, back at full employment. Something I may not have mentioned before, but you've probably seen in the textbooks, the term NAIRU, N-A-I-R-U, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, NAIRU. When you see that, they're talking about this point right here. NAIRU is the rate of unemployment at which we will not see inflation. It's the same thing as full employment, okay? Or what we call a 5% more or less unemployment rate, NAIRU, just parenthetically mentioning that. So here was the classical aggregate supply curve. And then what did Keynes say? Keynes said you don't go from A to B in a hurry because prices and wages are sticky down, and remember some of those other arguments. That in fact when you go from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, the aggregate supply curve really looks like this. Aggregate supply, here we go, right? And so when AD1 goes to AD2, you go from A to B, and what? And you're stuck there for quite a while. We don't know how long, but too long. And so Keynes said what we have to do, we can't wait for the economy to adjust down to here. What we have to do is increase aggregate demand. Remember all that? So we said this was what? This is the Keynesian sharp break aggregate supply curve. It had a sharp break right here at the level of full employment. When aggregate demand hit this point, if it kept going, it created inflation. So in the Keynesian world, you were either up here with inflation or you were over here with some degree of recession, and you would like to be as close as you could to the sharp break. All right so far? Now, we change this a little bit, and we say maybe this is a more realistic view. This is just a temporary view. Maybe the aggregate supply curve has a Keynesian range, which shows that increases and decreases in demand don't affect prices. You're really in bad shape. This is the Depression. Maybe it also has a vertical range, the classical range, where things behave up and down in that range just the way the classical economists assumed. And maybe it's got this intermediate range, right in here, the intermediate range. Let's go ahead and label these. This is the classical, and this was the Keynesian range. Well, what happens in the intermediate range? When you have a change in aggregate demand, whether it's AD1 to AD2 or the other way, that every time you get a reduction in the rate of inflation, AD decreases. When inflation decreases, what happens? Unemployment increases. That in fact, while you're bringing down inflation, going from, let's say, A to B, you're bringing down inflation, but you're also going to a lower level of output, which means more unemployment. And if you want to increase from AD1 to AD2 so you can put more people back to work, right, the cost of that is going to be that the rate of inflation is going to go up. And so there's a constant trade-off. We can bring down inflation, but unemployment goes up. We can bring down unemployment, but inflation goes up. Okay, that relationship is called a Phillips curve. You can read about it briefly. I'm not going to spend that much time with it right here. Just see that within the intermediate range, you have that trade-off between inflation and unemployment. When you fix one, the other gets worse, vice versa. Now, here's the one I really want to focus on, because maybe it gives us a better way to see things. Let's create what we're going to call the long-run aggregate supply curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve. It's going to look like this. We're going to say, well, the long-run aggregate supply curve at full employment looks just like what? The classical curve. So we're going to call this long-run aggregate supply. All right? And in the long run, wherever the demand curve falls, in the long run, that's where we're headed. But there is also a short-run aggregate supply curve. Two different ways to show it up here. Here's one. Suppose the short-run aggregate supply curve, and the short-run curve is going to be that intermediate range with the curve to it. Suppose that this was short-run aggregate supply, SAS, short-run aggregate supply. That would mean that today we are at A, right here, and that in the absence of any other forces or policies, in the long run we will be moving towards B, right here. So that in the short run, what's going on? Well, we've got a bit of unemployment going on. We're in a recession maybe. But in the long run, what will happen from that recession? We'll go back to the classical arguments. With enough people unemployed for a long enough time, wages will fall, prices will fall, and then sales will pick back up. Okay, in the long run, yeah, those forces are at work. How long does it take to get from A to B? Well, we're back to the criticism of the classical model. We don't know how long, but maybe too long. So we can show, here's where we are, here's where we're being pushed. What do we want to do? Do we want to wait it out in the classical sense, or do we want to stimulate aggregate demand in the Keynesian sense? Or can we stimulate short-run aggregate supply in the supply-side sense? But at least this picture gets us to a point where we can see where we are and where the forces are pushing us. Let's try another version of this. We have our long-run aggregate supply. We have our aggregate demand. And suppose I showed you a short-run aggregate supply curve over here. Short-run aggregate supply. Here's where we are at A. And where are we going to go in the long run? What are the forces at work? Where are we going to be in the long run? Always on the demand curve and the long run curve. So we're being pushed, or there are forces at work pushing us in the direction of point B. Well, what's going on at point A? At point A, what's our level of output? We're out here. We're beyond the production possibilities frontier. We're producing more than our full employment output. What's happened to the unemployment rate here? The unemployment rate here, if this is 5%, this is maybe 3% unemployment. How's the economy doing? Wow, everybody's got jobs, everybody's making money, everybody's spending. How's life in your business? You're selling stuff as fast as you can put it on the shelves. You're selling stuff as fast as you can produce it. And in fact, one of your big constraints, it's hard to find employees. The unemployment rate is so low, the only folks out there without jobs are derelicts and discontents and college professors maybe, right? Everybody's got a job. If you can't find a job in this market, what should you do? My answer is you should go home to mama, because everybody's finding a job here. If you can't find a job, you've got to look in that mirror really closely, okay? Now, if it's hard to find employees, how are you in your business, how are you going to find some more employees? Because sales are booming, you need to produce more. Easy. You go out and you steal them from some of the other competitors you have. And how do you steal them? You offer them more money. And so now, does this sound familiar? Now, out here beyond full employment, wages go up, prices go up, and sales begin to decrease. Exactly the opposite of how the classical view said we got out of a recession. How we got out of this hyperinflation or high rate of production. We go from A to B by watching wages rise. As a result, producers raise their prices, and at those higher prices, sales decrease. As their sales decrease, they don't need as many workers. They begin to lay people back off, and we move back to where we always move in the long run, right? To our natural rate of unemployment, 5%. But again, this diagram lets us say what's going on in the economy. It's another way to view the economy, to talk about it, and maybe explain what this policy would do or this policy might accomplish. Okay? I want you ready to look at this graph, wherever that supply curve is, and talk about, if we're on this side of full employment or if we're on this side of full employment, what's going on. Okay? Cool.